Some of you may have heard the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real live ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. That is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew $30 million on the place. Yeah, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships to safely operate, and there's even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That's where the factual nature of the story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and obviously wasn't because, quote, foreigners are lazy. Both are convenient excuses. No, I sincerely doubt these reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's Palace. Near the beach side of Emerald Isle in North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Palace in the late 1990s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. If you were unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, then you might recognize the story, The Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you know it as Disney's cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened or pursued by other animals. Mowgli's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high-priced land for the project, and there's actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, and they turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it Mickey Mouse Highway. Then there was the concept art. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Corporation actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. When they showed the concept art, this giant Indian palace surrounded by jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear, well, suffice to say, everyone flipped their shit. We're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle, and loincloths, not only in the center of a relatively wealthy area, but also a somewhat xenophobic area of the southern United States. It was a questionable mix at the point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over its knee as well. The houses were razed, the land was cleared, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do or say about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and the local venues came into play, and their opinions turned on a dime. So anyway, Treasure Island, the Bahamas. Disney sunk those millions in and then split. Same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Construction was complete. Visitors could actually stay at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. Then it all just stopped. Disney shut it down and nobody knew what the hell to think. But they were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. It honestly didn't give up the other place thought, since hearing it close over a decade ago. I lived maybe 4 hours from Emerald Isle, so really I could only hear the rumblings and didn't experience anything firsthand. Then I read this article from someone who explored the Treasure Island Resort and posted a whole blog about all the crazy shit he found there. Stuff just left behind. Things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. Hell, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking the place. People there just felt as angry about Treasure Island as folks did about Mowgli's Palace. Plus, there were rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local waters when they closed, including sharks. Who would want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting at is this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years had passed since its closing, I figured it'd be cool to do some urban explanation at Mowgli's Palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there's anything I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time getting there, because honestly it took me another year after I first found the Treasure Island article to get around to actually get up to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place. They had basically scrubbed it clean. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though it was to be in expected since they'd all swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out there lauding their embarrassment, you know? Recently, I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search results, basically for no good reason. Looking back, it's probably not for that nobody spoke of the resort, it's rather their words were made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the place. All I had to go on was an old as hell map I received in the mail back in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent out to people who recently been added to Disney World. And I guess since I had been there in the late 80s, that was recent. I didn't really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved in with my books and comics from childhood. I really only remembered it months into my research, even though it took me another few weeks to locate the storage bin my parents had shoved it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had moved into the beach in recent years, or old residents who just sneered at me and made rude gestures the second I mentioned to say, "Where can I find Mowgli's ... The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth. Tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area, mixed with the native species of flora that actually belong there, and I tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort. Tremendous, monolithic wooden gates whose supports to each side looked like they had been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap with hand-painted letters scrawled in black. Abandoned by Disney. Clearly the handiwork of some past local or an employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through, but not drive. So grabbing my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed a layout of the resort, I set out on foot. The inner grounds of the place were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged against piles by their coconuts. Banana plants seemingly stood on their own stinking, bug-riddled refuse. And then there was a clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxious tall weeds and stinking black mushrooms. All this remained of an outdoor structure with broken, rotting wood and various charred bits of unidentifiable material. What was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was now simply a pile of assorted debris chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting part of the grounds was a statue of Baloo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, who stood in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave toward no one, staring at an empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird shit covered whole swaths of his fur and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti where the original paint hadn't peeled and chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they had been taken off their hinges and were stolen. Above the front doors of the now gaping mall where they had been, someone else once again painted, "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you about the awesome stuff I saw in that palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums, but no. The inside of the building was so stark, so bare, I could actually think people who had stolen the molding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desks, giant fake trees, they were all resting among this empty echo chamber that amplified every step like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to all locations they may seem in any interesting way whatsoever. The kitchen, as you will imagine, an industrial food prep area with all the appliances in space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf space. Hooks hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat. As I stood there for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook swung in a different direction, but their movement was slow and small, as it was almost impossible to see. I figured it was caused by my footsteps, so I stepped on one from swinging by clutching it in my fist, then carefully letting go. But within seconds, it started to swing once more. The bathrooms were in much the same state as the state of their palace. Just as the Treasure Island Resort, someone had melancholy smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was even about a half-inch of rancid, sinking, stagnant water on the floor. I didn't stay there very much longer. What's odd is that the toilets and the sinks and the bidets in the ladies' room, yes, I went there, all dripped, leaked, or just ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut the water off long, long ago. And there were plenty of room in the resort, but naturally I didn't have time to look through every single one. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room, as I really think I had heard a quiet conversation coming out of it. Though it was just a whisper, part of my own breathing echoing in the silence. Just another case of the sound of flowing water playing tricks in my mind. This is what it sounded like. 1. I didn't believe it. 2. Short, unknown reply. 1. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. 2. Your father told you. 1. Unknown reply, or probably just weeping. I know, that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Why I thought that there might have been something running in that room, or worse, some vagrants who had holed up there and probably would have knifed me. At the front doors of the palace again, I figured I hadn't found much note of anything and I wasted the trip up. As I looked through the door, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I apparently missed. Something that would just give me one last thing to show off all my trouble. Even just a photograph. It was a life-size statue of a python, probably 80 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on a pedestal right in the center of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell on the object in the perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. I then stood on my toes, snapped another. I moved closer to get the details of its face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned and slithered off the pedestal, across the grass, into the tree. All 80 feet of it. Its long head disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunning spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals onto the grounds. Right there on my floor plan map was the reptile house. I should have known. I read about the sharks at Treasure Isle, and I should have known they'd done this. I was dumbfounded, utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back to Earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, back toward the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I wasn't taking any chances, and backed my way into the building. Took a few deep breaths, and it slapped my own face to get myself right in the head after that. I looked for a place to sit down, as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at that point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline on the broken glass and dead leaf carpet, or haul myself up onto the desk of questionable reasonability. I had seen some stairs near the palace lobby and decided to have a seat there until I felt better. The staircase was just far enough away from the front of the building to be relatively clean, save for a starting accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the phrase "Abandoned by Disney" motto I have been so accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to keep somewhat clean. The stairway led downward below ground level. Using my camera flash as a sort of improvised flashlight, I could see that the staircase ended in a metal mesh door with a padlock. A door on the sign. A real sign. Read, "Mascots only. Thank you." This perked up my spirits a little bit, for 2 reasons. 1, a mascots only area would have definitely had some interesting stuff back in the day. 2, the padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the one place I could actually explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or wantonly steal. I'd come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself it was okay to take anything I wanted because, hey, abandoned. It didn't take much to bust the lock. Well, actually, that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of their work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall, something nobody else had apparently thought of, or had even done at the time. The mascots only area was a startling and very welcome change from the rest of the building I had seen. For one, every second or third fluorescent light bulb was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Although nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age and exposure had definitely taken their toll. Tables had notepads and pens. There were clocks, even a punch-in clock on the wall completed with filled-out time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and there's even a small break room with an old, static-filled television and long-rotted food and drink on the counter. It was one of those post-apocalyptic movies where everything is left in the state of evacuation. As I walked through the maze-like sub-basement hallways of the mascot-only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, papers scattered, and almost melded with the damp floor, and a large carpet of mold was slowly overtaking the real rotting crimson flooring. Everything was just sort of squishy. Anything would disintegrate into mush when I applied even the least amount of force, and clothing items hanging on hooks in one of the rooms simply fell to moist threads if I tried to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me was the light was becoming more and more sparse and unreliable as I went further into the dank, suffocating depths of the place. Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words "Character Prep 1" stenciled on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this is probably where the costumes were kept, and I defiantly wanted a photograph of the twisted, dank, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle that I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and walked away. That was then there was a slight popping sound, and the door slowly creaked open. Inside the room was dark, pitch black. I used the camera flash to look for a light switch in the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my sense of excitement with a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest that had passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like the light was just going to keep getting brighter and brighter until all the bulbs exploded. But when I thought I just reached this critical stage, the lights dimmed a bit and steadied. The room was exactly as I pictured. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There's an entire rack of loincloths and native clothing on the hangers toward the back. What I found odd was I wanted to photograph right away. It was a Mickey Mouse at the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was lying on its back in the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur on the costumes was rotten and shedding, creating black patches. What was even odder, however, was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of an actual Mickey Mouse. Black where it's supposed to be white, and white where it's supposed to be black. His normally red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting, enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. I took a photo of the costumes hanging on the wall, upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces, even with some plastic eyes missing. I decided to stage a shot. Just one of the deraggled characters' heads on the slick, grimy floor. I reached for the headpiece of a Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. When I looked into the face of a wide-eyed, moldering head, a large clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and in between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and lower jaw remained, staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately, as you'd expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back at the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture, you know? I had to, for a number of reasons that may seem silly, but only if you didn't think it through. I needed proof of what happened. Essentially, if Disney was going to somehow make this go away, I had no doubt in my mind, right from the start, that even if it was a little bit gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, the photo negative opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting up, then climbing to its feet. The Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood there in the center of the room, its fake face just staring directly at me as it mumbled, "No." Over and over and over I mumbled. With shaking hands, a violent thrusting heart, and legs that at once began to turn to jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen where Mickey's outline moved to. Then the camera died, went black and quiet, and broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. "Hey," it said in a hushed, perverted, but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. "Want to see my head come off?" It started to pull at its own head, working its clumsy, glove-clean fingers around its neck with clawing, impatient movements similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free of a predator's jaws. It worked its digits into its neck. So much blood. So much thick, chunky, yellow blood. I turned away as I heard a snickering tear of cloth and flesh. Only cared about getting away. Above the door of this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal with bone or fingernails. Abandoned by God. I never got the photos out of the camera. I never write the blog entry about it. After I ran from that place, fled from my sanity, if not for my very life, I knew Disney wasn't going to let anyone know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. They didn't want anything like that getting out.